Good evening. We'll be getting started in just a minute or two. Please bear with us while we get everybody in place. Thanks. Okay, we'll be starting in just a moment. Thanks for bearing with us. Okay, well, good evening. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs at the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NASAR. I thank you for making the time to be with us tonight for this program. Tonight's program is being presented as part of the ongoing Nasser Kalust Gulbenkian Foundation lecture series on contemporary Armenian issues, and we thank the Gulbenkian Foundation for their continued support of our programming on such topics. This is indeed a contemporary and a timely topic: genocide education in Massachusetts, a new mandate, a new era, and new challenges. And it is relevant, we think, of course, beyond the borders of the Bay State. The new genocide mandate was passed and signed into law by Governor Baker just 2 months ago. But the roots of this law and of this issue extend considerably deeper. And I recalled that back in 2005, I was involved in organizing a NASAR program on Armenian genocide education, reaching into the school curriculum with Richard Hovhannissian, Adam and Margot Strom from Facing History and Ourselves, and Henry Theriault from Worcester State College, at a time when the guidelines, but not yet a mandate, had been adopted by Massachusetts for the teaching of genocide. And this was still, at that time, a rather new issue. And in fact, only a few weeks after we held that program, I don't think there was any cause and effect, this faced a serious challenge in the form of a lawsuit against the Department of Education, accusing it of censorship for using the word genocide to describe, well, the Armenian genocide, and for not including denialist materials in its curriculum guide. You will recall that that lawsuit was dismissed, and this, I'm sure, will come up again tonight in the context of our discussions. So here we are, many years later. Massachusetts has joined the ranks of states mandating genocide education, including the Armenian genocide, in public, middle, and high schools. We'll now engage in a discussion of how the law came into being, the challenges it overcame that were overcome to gain its passage, and the potential impact on students and on society as a whole, with a terrific panel for whom I am only going to offer very brief introductions that in no way do justice to their many accomplishments. And I think in the order in which they are going to speak, they are as follows. Eric Cohen, who is the chairman of the Massachusetts Coalition to Save Darfur. Herman Parutian is the Massachusetts State Chair of the Armenian Assembly of America. Dr. Dikran Kaligian is a historian and a representative of the Armenian National Committee of America for Eastern Massachusetts. And Dr. Lerna Ekmekcioglu is the Macmillan Stewart Associate Professor of History at MIT and the author of Recovering Armenia, The Limits of Belonging in Post-Genocide Turkey. We will hear brief remarks from each of the panelists. Then we will proceed to some discussion points and questions from me as moderator, and then we will be open to your questions, which need to be submitted via the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. One has just appeared as I'm speaking. That's amazing. Maybe there's a question about my introduction. Anyway, that is where the questions should be posted, and we invite you to post them there. We will get to as many as possible, and please, we encourage you to make them pertinent to the topic of tonight's program. So with that, let me invite Eric Cohen to speak.
Good evening, everyone. Here's a bit of history. The first bill that sought to mandate genocide education was filed January 8th, 2009. That bill did not go anywhere. Similar bills mandating genocide education were filed in every legislative session that followed, finally succeeding and becoming law on December 2nd, 2021. It took nearly 13 years from the submission of the first bill for genocide education mandate to become law. In the end, support was nearly unanimous, 39-0 in the Senate, 157 to 2 opposed in the House. Year after year, we testified in support of genocide education bills in public hearings of the Joint Committee on Education. I think that was where I first met Dikron. Each hearing had at least one bill on genocide education among the several dozen bills that the Joint Committee considered every session. The large number of education bills made it all the more challenging to explain why genocide education deserved action by the committee. In the early years, we criticized the then current 2003 social studies curriculum framework for not teaching about genocide. That curriculum framework had only one reference to genocide, a mention of the Armenian genocide that was framed as an event or consequence of World War I. Not only was that not teaching about genocide, but it incorrectly framed the Ottoman plans for mass killings and the destruction of the Armenian people. It failed to connect earlier mass killings of Armenians that preceded the escalation to genocide, and it missed a chance to teach what genocide scholars have learned. Genocide doesn't just happen, it develops in stages with characteristics. For years, we got the feedback that bills were not needed because the social studies curriculum framework would be updated soon. That update finally came in 2018. It had 9 references to genocide, including naming Armenia, Ukraine, Cambodia, and Rwanda, and implicitly included the Holocaust. However, nearly all the instances of genocide were optional rather than required to be taught. And further, the coverage of the Armenian genocide repeated the defects from the prior curriculum. Importantly, the World History 2 curriculum included a topic 7, quote, the politics of difference among people, conflicts, genocide, and terrorism, unquote. This section of the curriculum provided a good structure for including genocide education if it became a required unit of study. Another objection was that Massachusetts did not like mandates, particularly disliked unfunded mandates for schools. The implication was that teachers and school districts would oppose genocide education mandates. So the Joint Education Committee or one of their chairs would often rewrite the genocide education bills to remove the mandate and report out a weak bill. Over the years, support for genocide education grew. In 2019, ADL created a coalition to support a genocide education bill and actively lobbied for it along with JCRC Boston. With their help, the 2019 bill had more co-sponsors in the Senate and House than ever before. Unfortunately, the Joint Education Committee once again rewrote the bill and removed the mandate. That weak bill passed the Senate but died in the House, which was probably a good thing for our hopes for a stronger bill. There were 2 schools of thought based on what happened in 2019. Some thought that a watered-down bill would encourage genocide education, represented progress, was better than nothing, and might be the best that we could get. We thought that the mandate bill was what was needed and what we must fight for. We believe that without a mandate, districts and classrooms that did not already teach about genocide would not even start. In 2021, ADL created a larger coalition for genocide education, and in parallel, we formed a smaller, focused coalition to aggressively lobby and support a mandate bill. Dikron, Herman and Laura Peruchian, along with Ukrainian and Cambodian colleagues, and I committed ourselves to not merely testify, but do everything we could to support a mandate so it could succeed. What emerged from the legislature was competing bills, one with a mandate and one without. Some supported the weak bill, some supported both. We supported and lobbied for the mandate bill only. After extensive lobbying by our coalition, we had more co-sponsors than ever for the mandate bill, 30 of the 40 senators and 32 of the 159 representatives. However, once again, the mandate was removed when the bill was reported out of the Joint Education Committee. After further lobbying, the Senate Ways and Means Committee added the mandate language back into the bill, which then passed the Senate, was improved a bit more in the House Ways and Means Committee, and then passed the House. One factor that made a big difference in 2021 was that ADL had arranged letters of support in 2019 from both the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents and the Mass Association of School Committees. Both letters explicitly said that though they usually did not support mandates, the genocide education was a special case, consistent with the thrust of the social studies curriculum and worthy of support. These letters went a long way to addressing one of the major concerns of some legislators. Another factor was the National Survey on Holocaust Knowledge published in 2020, showing the stunningly poor knowledge of the millennial respondents in Massachusetts. Not surprisingly, if you don't teach kids, they won't learn. Another factor was that there were well-publicized incidents of anti-Semitism and ignorance of the Holocaust, including the notorious episode with the Duxbury football team. Those Duxbury players received necessary but belated education. But what about the rest of Massachusetts kids? After these incidents, more and more legislators spoke out in support of mandating genocide education, including House Speaker Mariano and Senate President Spelka. While Massachusetts delayed, we pointed to 20 other states that already required genocide education, including the largest states and our neighbors, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and more recently, New Hampshire and Maine. Surely Massachusetts deserved to join this list. And if not, what would that say about progressive, thoughtful Massachusetts? Lastly, I want to highlight the importance of the leadership and support of Senator Rodericks, who is the lead sponsor of the Genocide Education Mandate Bill and the chair of Senate Ways and Means. I'm grateful to have been part of a very fine team of effective and creative leaders, some of which you're hearing from tonight, working together for the Genocide Education Mandate Bill. I'm glad to report that it finally became law in Massachusetts. Honestly, I don't know if I could have campaigned again in yet another legislative session. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Now we will go to Herman Peruchian.
Hi, Mark. Hello, everybody. Good evening. I want to just sort of shift back into, my education in genocide and then sort of bring it back to today. I was born in Istanbul, Turkey, but I didn't know about the Armenian genocide until I actually came to this country, to the US. Of course, I knew that bad things had happened, knew family stories, but all I knew and what we heard was the chart. I didn't even know a name, didn't know genocide. It had a name. And actually, my ninth grade African-American social studies teacher, Mrs. Curry, knew more about it than I did when I started high school, which to me was obviously amazing. But coming from, the education in Istanbul, what I heard, learned, was exposed to was completely different than reality. The education there was to, in fact, blame the victim, the minorities, that the minorities, Armenians, and others were the traitors, they conspired against the motherland, etc. So I know personally, what it is to not only have not education, but really have been basically fed a bunch of lies. And I realized that creates the environment where you create second-class citizens, you create an environment of discrimination where the atrocities and genocide can happen again. So that was my deep motivation to be involved in this. And Mark, you were mentioning 2000s, even going back to 1998 in Massachusetts, when the legislation was sponsored by Senator Tolman and was passed. Even at that time, I mean, the Assembly leadership was very involved in making sure that the curriculum was in place. And you also mentioned down the road the lawsuit and all the efforts that went to push that back. But having sort of gone through those 2 decades of experience, we are at a different place now. As Eric said, moving from a recommended curriculum to actually having this mandated in Massachusetts middle schools and high schools is a huge step forward. And perhaps we'll talk about what the next challenges are, where we are now and where we go from here. But I wanted to just share that sort of bit of context for me and for my involvement, and certainly, being a part of this team, Eric and Dikran and others representing from other communities was a very powerful force. I will just say that powerful force actually bringing us to this day, and finally crossing the line with a very strong bill that mandates education in Massachusetts.
Thank you, Herman. Now, Dikran, please.
Thank you, Mark. I too want to give a little perspective of where we came from and what we need to go going forward. As Herman pointed out, the original bill that didn't mandate but created the guidelines for teaching genocides, including the Armenian genocide, was introduced in 1997 by Senator Warren Tolman in the Senate and his brother, Senator Stephen Tolman, in the House, and actually created a coalition then, which in some ways we've built on. It created a coalition of those who'd suffered from genocide and from other human rights violations. It spoke not just of the Holocaust, the genocide, Armenian genocide, the Cambodian genocide, but also the Middle Passage in the slave trade of Africans, the Great Hunger in Ireland, and other cases. And it's partly the foundation that was built in that first bill, and the attacks on it by the Turkish American community, by the Turkish government through their representatives in the United States, that has informed us as to what we've done going forward. So, for instance, just as we actually can see the change between 1997 and the bill that we just passed over the last 7 years, we worked on in the reaction, in fact, the statements of those members of the Turkish American community that testified at the public hearings on the bill. It's interesting. Well, first of all, the talking points have changed. And it's because the conditions have changed. The circumstances in this debate has changed because of what's happened in recent years. Number one, huge amount of additional research and publications on the Armenian genocide. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, the success that we as a community have found in passing just in the last year genocide recognition by the United States House of Representatives, then for the first time ever, genocide recognition by the United States Senate, and for the first time ever, an official statement by the President of the United States on April 24th that did not include any, what do we want to call it, any euphemisms. You know, we've found over the past 12 years, over multiple presidents, all kinds of ways to avoid using the words Armenian genocide. President Biden did none of that. It was a very clear statement. And because of these things, most of the usual talking points that Turkish Americans use when they testify, and mind you, they don't say they're against the bill. They only say that the Armenians and the Greeks should not be included in this bill because it wasn't a genocide. they're no longer able to make the same kind of arguments they did before. They can't say, oh, well, it's not clear, it's this. They've dropped that entirely because they know the immediate response by anyone will be, well, the House says it is, the president says it is, the Senate says it is. And so now what we heard, and there were, maybe Eric can correct me, 20 to 30 Turkish Americans out of 70 who signed up, but 20 to 30 actually testified in the public hearing against this bill. All of them only spoke about taking out, any reference to the Armenian genocide or to Pontic Greeks, but their talking points were quite different. Their talking points now almost entirely focused on the fact, oh, well, my children, Turkish American children, are going to be discriminated against. They're going to be made to feel uncomfortable. They might be bullied because they are Turkish American, and because there's this unjust accusation against Turkey that they committed genocide. Now, we all know this argument is nonsense, but if you even listen to the words, I think there are other things going on today in America as far as making sure that students aren't made uncomfortable by certain parts of history being taught that have their echoes in what we've already heard over the past 3 years, and these talking points that the Turkish consul in Boston distributed to the members of the Turkish American community, who then testified at the public hearing. I call that a success, that they are now forced into a smaller and smaller box of arguments that they can make, because we've had so much success in Massachusetts and across the United States in having our point of view accepted by a larger and larger and larger portion of the American public and the American institutions. Therefore, I'd like to finish up by talking about, what do we do now? Are we done? Too often we pass something and we say, oh, great, we won. Now we can go home and go back and watch Netflix. Unfortunately, as we learned in 1997, the battle is not done once you pass the law, because as we learned in 1997, the next step is they're now going to revise the guidelines as to how to teach about genocide, and especially how to teach about the Armenian genocide. They're going to have to revamp the resources and the organizations that are referenced that can be contacted by teachers, so they when they want to meet their requirement under this mandate. And as we learned in the 90s, the Turkish American organizations went and the reason there was a lawsuit was because they managed to insert denialist material and denialist sources and denialist resources into the curriculum. When it was removed, that's when they created their phony First Amendment lawsuit. And so our next step, number one, is going to be to work to do outreach to the Department of Education in Massachusetts to make sure that we have input to the guidelines that are going to be revised, how they're going to be revised, to make sure that the resources that are there about teaching about the Armenian genocide are about teaching about the Armenian genocide, not that it didn't happen, which is what happened in the past. Secondly, we want to make sure that we are providing as many resources as possible, and that they are noting these resources when they do their guide to teachers. Because what a lot of school departments are now going to say is, well, my teachers don't know, if we want to teach about genocide, how are we going to know how to teach about genocide? It's a different subject. Most teachers don't know about the Armenian genocide. So in fact, I actually have two hats tonight. One, Armenian National Committee, but I'm also on the board of the Genocide Education Project, which is a nationwide organization that does teacher training workshops, teaching teachers, this is how you teach about genocide, and specifically, this is also how you teach about the Armenian genocide. Here's the history, here's some sample curriculum. There are several sample types of curriculum that a teacher can adopt. So it's already written there. They don't have to start from zero. And so one of our purposes is to make sure that the Department of Education includes the Genocide Education Project as one of these groups. We already do these types of training workshops. We've done them, at New England Social Studies conferences that bring social studies teachers from throughout New England. We've had a specific teacher training workshop at the Armenian Library and Museum in Watertown that for Watertown and Boston public school teachers. And this is a resource everyone who's watching this can also make a part of their argument when they speak to their schools about, hey, look, you know, why don't you invite this organization to come train your teachers? You know, they're ready to come to teach them how to meet this mandate. And so that would actually be the last step. And this is something for all of you, everyone who's watching this to keep in mind, is that there's a role for all of you. If you've been frustrated because your children don't go to Watertown High School or Waltham High School or the 2 or 3 others that already have strong programs on the Armenian genocide, so the Newton High Schools, for instance, this is your chance. Approach whoever it might be. You can approach your school committee, you can approach your school department, you can approach the principal of your child's high school or middle school, or even better, the social studies coordinators, the person who's charge of the social studies curriculum for your high school, your child's high school, and say, you may not be aware, there is now a mandate that you have to teach about genocide. It just passed, it's starting next fall. I would like you to include teaching of the Armenian genocide. And by the way, here's some resources that we're going to provide to you. And, you know, we're happy at Genocide Education Project to provide these resources to you. The Armenian National Committee, the Armenian Assembly, approach any of us. We're all happy to give you the materials to say, here are the list of some books. Here are the list of some organizations like who can do teacher training. And these are things that you can actually hand over to the social studies coordinator saying, I'm going to try to make your life easier by providing the materials. And then you, in exchange, I'd like you, when you choose which genocides you're going to talk about, that you include the Armenian genocide. This is what I hope everyone will take from this, that, you know, the hardest part of the job is done, but now the slower, the grassroots work going by school department to make sure that this curriculum is taught and taught well falls on all of us. Thank you.
Tigran, thanks. If you've run out of hats, we will now proceed. And I'd like to ask Lerna to speak as well. Lerna.
Thank you, Mark, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And I would like to thank Eric, Herman, and Tigran for their work in bringing this project to fruition. I have nothing to do with this, the passing of the mandate or all the labor that it took them for years, really, to bring us here. I guess I'm here as a scholar of the genocide, genocide in general, specifically the Armenian genocide, but I also teach other genocide, especially in connection to gender, at a college. So I'm not even a middle or high school teacher, but I have some experience in that. And when we were discussing with Mark as to how I can contribute to this discussion, he asked me if, given that, he basically asked me what's the most important thing that I think it is to convey to students of any level, really, about genocide in general and specifically about the Armenian genocide, given that there will be like really short amount of time to be spent on the Armenians, at least, if any, what should be prioritized. And what impact, if any, does genocide education have on countering denial and hate speech or preventing other genocides from occurring? So I would like to, in the next 5 minutes, address these questions somewhat together and give my perspective of why I think this is really timely. So what's the most important thing to convey about genocide? As we all know, genocide is a very physical event. It involves either mass murder or mass forcible conversion. That being the case, the most important thing to convey about genocide is not about this physical material quality to it, but about the language that enables bloodbath. Genocides require previous work. This is because human nature is both intrinsically violent and intrinsically peaceful, and that is why it is marvelous. If I were a middle or high school teacher charged with this mandate to teach genocide, I would try to make students understand that when and if certain conditions are met, every human community is capable of committing genocide. But if these conditions are not met, that is, if we prevent them from happening, humans do not butcher other humans just for the fun of it. And the most important necessary condition for genocide to occur is for the target group to be discursively branded in a certain way, otherwise known as dehumanization. And I'm so glad that this language of inhumanity of genocide did make it into the mandate itself. I think being able to convey to students the dangers of dehumanizing a certain group in language is the most important thing. Without the prior work of labeling a certain group as traitors, internal tumors, rats, cockroaches, rapists, job stealers, you cannot turn humans into perpetrators of genocide. That's why what we name things, people, and events matter. And as Armenians, we know it really well, that the naming matters. If there is one thing that I want, in general, my MIT students to learn about genocide, it is that when it comes to language, there is a big difference between artificial PC, political correctness, and a genuine attention that we pay to discourse that we produce and reproduce, and discourse that we actively refuse to circulate because we know it might have real repercussions in physical reality. This is all very relevant, actually, in the contemporary society that we live in. Studies after study shows that since 2016, anti-immigrant rhetoric has been on the rise, as well as anti-immigrant violence, and not just. A new book published by New York University Press titled "It Can Happen Here: White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the United States" focuses on the rising tide of white supremacist violence and white power infiltration of government positions. In other words, there is no such thing as American exceptionalism here, especially if we consider that this country itself is based on the removal somewhat of indigenous people. But please don't get me wrong. This is an important point. And I think the framing of this mandate in the contemporary moment is really significant. This is not an attempt on my part to present genocide education as a partisan issue. Far from it. I would want to actually emphasize that we should avoid politicization of genocide education as much as possible. It literally is a humanity issue, and it should stay that way. Having said that, the January 6th insurrection alone makes, and given the history of it, starting from 2009 and passing now, this makes me think that there is indeed a connection between the rising trend towards intolerance and radicalization and the Massachusetts Department of Education's willingness to pass the mandate, and near unanimously. And I welcome that. That brings me to the other question: what impact, if any, does genocide education have in preventing future genocides or their denial? I don't think we can answer this question. I find this question fascinating, obviously, but just only as a thought exercise, because empirically, we don't know it. I don't know a case where a genocide occurred in a society where there was previous genocide education. Similarly, I'm not aware of any studies that show that previous genocide education prevented a possible genocide from happening. Yet, the genocide education mandate is not only about genocide, it also is about human rights violations. It does have that language in it. The mandate specifically promotes the teaching of human rights issues in connection with the genocide and radicalization. The whole institution of formal education operates with the assumption that the kind of values we teach at school have a formative effect on students' growing minds. In this regard, even if we do not for sure know how preventive genocide education might be, it's still, I think, a good investment of our time and resources to teach students topics such as importance of coexistence, tolerance towards difference, dangers of authoritarianism, problems with dehumanization, all falling under the rubric of genocide education. As previously discussed, it's not enough to mandate that genocide be taught. How we do it matters, which brings me to the more specific question of what is the most important to be taught about the Armenian case. And I know that Dikran has and the team prepared like great curricula. I'm sure they have this in mind, but at least this is based on my experience talking about this genocide to like at this point for 15 years, students at college level at MIT and in many other places that I was invited, especially in 2015, my book was coming out, speaking to these people, some of them including Turkish populations, but usually just like Americans. This is my answer. The most important thing that needs to be communicated at the end of that unit on the Armenian genocide is that the Turks did not commit genocide because they were Turks, that they did not commit genocide because they were Muslims. They did it because they were humans and the right kind of conditions were met at a certain time in history where animosity turned into an attempt at wholesale elimination, which connects to my first point, obviously, right? The conditions, the structural reasons for it matters more than anything else. Students should learn to de-essentialize identity categories and should be able to ask questions such as, if the reason for violence was, for instance, Islam, or the violent nature of these like Middle Eastern people, barbarian Turks, why didn't they Muslims, let's say, kill non-Muslims earlier or force them to convert? Why weren't Ottoman Jews at the time killed? How would this argument account for Muslims who refused to kill anyone? This obviously, since I'm sure all of you know, this is not meant to absolve Turkish people of their crimes. There is a huge difference here. They do have responsibilities like we all do to history, but there really is nothing to be gained for blaming people for what their ancestors did. And it's a very different thing than keeping their descendants accountable. In short, as I have noted in one of my previous articles, in the classroom, when and if my students get that Armenians were not killed during World War I by the Ottoman Turkish government, if they are not killed only because they were Christians, but they would not have been killed had they been Muslims or Jews, I consider myself successful. And for now, I would like to end it with this.
Lerna, thank you so much, and thank you all for your comments and for giving us some context and some more information and insights. So, a few general questions before we go to the Q&A from the audience. Which again, audience, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There's a very fundamental question that I'm not sure was specifically addressed here. What does the mandate and what doesn't the mandate mandate? In other words, in its simplest form, the mandate calls for what? Perhaps Eric or Herman or Dikran can best speak to this.
Well, maybe I could start out and the others can chime in. So the most important thing that it does is it requires that the history of genocide be taught. And it identifies it as a required piece of teaching that has to happen in the career of a middle or high school student. It does not say when it has to happen. It does not say that it has to happen every year. It does not list how it has to happen, but it makes that statement. In addition, it provides some general encouragement for districts, and that encouragement takes the form of every school district has to write a report every year to the state saying how they're teaching about genocide and provide copies of their materials they're using. And then thirdly, the bill provided for some funding by first creating a trust fund that can be used for projects relating to improving genocide education. And secondly, by providing some actual dollars by routing fines that have been paid in the state of Massachusetts for hate crimes to be used by that trust fund. So this is why it's so important what Dikran identified the next steps with what happens with the curriculum from the social studies group about how they put into the curriculum how genocide, the history of genocide is going to be taught. So that's where the rubber's really going to hit the road. In earlier versions of the bill, there were sometimes lists, partial lists of genocides. And whoever was writing the bill and whoever was advising them would include their favorite ones. So if they were being influenced by Armenians, the Armenian genocide was in the list. And that was almost always the case. And the Holocaust was always in the list. And sometimes Native Americans were in the list, sometimes Ukrainians were in the list. And this bothered some legislators who didn't want to see a list be codified in law because it was ever changing. And even if you used wishy-washy words like including but not limited to examples from this list, they didn't want to get into the middle of that. And it was interesting, as Dikran was pointing out, that many of the objections from the Turkish community were to the fact that there was a list in the law. It didn't seem to bother them that there was already a list in the curriculum. So it avoided
talking points.
Yeah, it avoided a problem, but it without making really any difference. And just to throw in something else about the complaints from the Turkish community that I think was triggered by one of the questions. We spoke with many legislators, House and Senate, and we asked them, we were looking for why the bill wasn't making progress in prior years and what they were worried about. And we gave them test questions like, what about these complaints from the Turkish consul or the Turkish community who said that it wasn't really so and so on. And they said, well, they listened respectfully, but that didn't affect them. That was not convincing. So in general, for the legislators, it was an established fact. It wasn't a question whether there was a genocide of Armenians. That was no longer being litigated. The question was what to do next. And it was these other factors that were either blocking them from moving or allowing to start to move. So that was a very interesting discovery because it meant we didn't have to argue that part of the case really with anyone. We tested with many people and universally that's what they told us. So.
And it sounds like, notwithstanding the lawsuit, which we've touched on, that the both sides need to be presented argument no longer seems to be being offered. Am I correct, gentlemen? And
not this time, no. Yeah, that hasn't been, that wasn't one of the talking points. It might come up at a later point, of course, but at the public hearings, no, that didn't come out. And I think in part because it's a harder argument to make now than it was 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, picking up on that, one of the questions asked about whether it really helped that Biden made his statement as a president and that the Congress made its combined resolution. And it certainly was a good thing that it helped. It eliminated those talking points getting argued because you can no longer sensibly say, well, the United States doesn't even say it so, because the United States has said it so. And so you argue against yourself if you try to bring up that claim. So as Dikran pointed out, the Turkish arguments were getting weaker and weaker all the time. On the other hand, as I was saying, for the legislators, I don't think Biden's statement had an impact on them. They've long ago been there.
Herman, you wanted to add?
I was just going to add, I want to just read the two lines from the bill that actually just sort of mandates this.
Thank you.
So basically just says every school district shall, for the purpose of educating middle and high school students, provide instruction on the history of genocide consistent with the content standards articulated in the history and social science curriculum framework adopted by the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. So that's really kind of the meat of it. Shall teach this, but then refers to the curriculum. So that's where, as Dikran said, where a lot of work now needs to be done to ensure that the curriculum is consistent, it's good, it's valid, it's solid. And if that is, then each school district is obligated to teach genocide.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. It's very simple language, but which politically is actually good. It doesn't exclude anybody. No group is upset that they're excluded from this, but that's why the guidelines are so important. And one thing I should point out as to I talked about social studies coordinators. We often think, okay, well, this will be taught as part of history. That's not genocide can be taught outside of history. Many of the teachers I have done teacher trainings for are actually teach English. They teach language arts, because the only way you don't, besides just teaching from, okay, during history, this happened during World War I, there's so much new literature that have come out since 1997. So many books, whether it's Crispo Jalian or books of fiction that talk about somebody who was in the genocide, the genocide is happening, or somebody, an American Armenian who's here after the genocide. These are all available. For instance, my children went to a Watertown high school, and as part, the schools always have a summer reading book. For 10th grade in Watertown High School, the book is Forgotten Fire. It's a book about a boy who survived the genocide. So here it is. It's an English it's being taught in English. It broadens the ability to talk about it. And in some ways, it makes it easier for younger students to be able to understand it, that you're actually reading a book about a child going through it, as opposed to trying to explain, okay, how did 1.5 million people, Turkey did this, Germany, World War I, etc. Sometimes it's easier to do it through an English department. So even though we talk about social studies, you don't have to limit yourself to that as well. It's also possible to talk to English teachers and say, and again, there are plenty of options. Here's a list of books that you might consider having your students read, so that they can learn about this historical fact that is now required to be taught at some point.
I'd like to ask Lerna and Herman, although Herman may have touched on this already, since half of our panelists received their primary education in Turkey, to contrast or contextualize this mandate with their own experience being educated in Turkey, and what, if anything, I know you're not in high school now, but what, if anything, is conveyed in the high school curriculum in Turkey about, the events of 1915 under any name? I'd like to ask Lerna first.
There is a mandate there too, to teach it in a certain way. Unlike in the United States, in Turkey, the curriculum is written in a most centralized way. The Minister of Education, based in Ankara, decides on the content, and there's only one history book for each grade that they have to approve, and they distribute. That is centrally distributed from Ankara to all schools inside the country. regardless if it's a public school or a private school or a minority school. That means that even in the Armenian schools or Greek schools, or the Jewish school, the students are exposed to the same kind of material that the non-Armenian, non-minority students are. And in these textbooks, to this day, Armenians are branded, as Herman already mentioned, the main inciters to violence. They are the problem. They did align with the Western powers, the enemies of the Ottomans, the Russians, and they had it coming. They provoked a civil war, during which some unfortunate losses maybe happened, again, always in like this passive tense from both sides. And I mean, this is even I'm giving a nicer version than I think how it was. In fact, it's like the Armenians doing all this, the massacring. It's really just like the like opposite of what in fact happened. It is a full wholesale fabrication of facts. And it hasn't changed. Even though scholarship changed, the textbooks in Turkey at least have not reflected yet the changes, because at the university level in Turkey, yes, maybe in the last 4 or 5 years, especially, the government is increasingly getting more and more authoritarian. But despite so, even as we speak, in Turkey, at least in some private universities, but even in some public universities, the topic of the genocide is still being discussed, right? So institutions of higher learning are very different than middle school and high school learning.
Well, I would just add, it's been a few years since my high school, or years in Istanbul. I went to Armenian schools, and as Lerna said, but it was the history that was sent from Ankara, the Ministry of Education, that everybody learned. And Mark, there is no such thing as events of 1915, not that I remember anyway. The whole thing is about the context of the War of Independence. So how the Ottoman Empire became the Turkish Republic, and along the way, some really bad things happened. Armenians and others, again, they were the traitors and such. And the history that I remember being taught is really all of that, and how, Turkey overcame all these minorities and was able to regain its independence. And what happened to the Armenians, etc., is not really very much highlighted at all. If anything, that's just sort of collateral damage on the way to independence of Turkey.
Thank you. Yeah, a different topic for maybe another day would be actually, because I'm ignorant of this myself anyway, how not just the Armenian genocide, but how genocide as a subject is taught in Armenia in high schools, and maybe I can put that on the list of things to be talked about in the future, because it would be interesting to know. I believe it was Eric, in your remarks at the beginning, you mentioned the role that ADL played in this legislation and getting it to move forward. I'm sure many listeners, viewers, were surprised at that, given the sometimes not positive role that, as a national organization, that ADL has played over the years regarding the Armenian genocide. Could you talk about that, and whether this represents a major change of attitude on the part of the organization, or what?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of ADL, but I'll give you my personal point of view about this. it wasn't the legislation about genocide education that made the change in the ADL. It was Abe Foxman being removed from running ADL to allow the ADL to adopt and run with the facts of history, and in my view, be true to its promise as an organization to fight against hate and hate speech, and to call out these problems when they saw them. And in particular, my personal experience with Robert Treston, who's been for a long time now the Northeast regional head of ADL, has been very positive, even when he was still under the thumb of Abe Foxman. So Abe, having been gone, gave them room to maneuver, and then I don't know what prompted, in particular, them deciding to exert themselves beginning in 2019 on the bill, but it really made a huge difference that it did. And they had no compunctions, no concerns whatsoever about acknowledging the Armenian genocide as one of the first of the 20th century. I've seen no hangover from the Abe Foxman days since his departure.
Thanks. A question from someone who I take to be outside of Massachusetts. How can those of us who live in states where there is no such mandate and where there isn't a large Armenian community advocate for genocide education?
I'll take that one.
Please.
That's a very good question. Well, one, it's going to depend on your state. I know Eric already posted a list of states that have mandated genocide education. Even if you're in a state with a small Armenian population, there are already nationwide efforts to mandate genocide education in general, not specifically Armenian. A number of groups, including ADL, are trying to pass this in a number of states. The key there is, one is to find out what organizations are working on it, and are they working in your state? And then is to connect with them and say, okay, while we're lobbying for this, let's make sure that the Armenian genocide is not excluded, because whereas the Massachusetts law was just one line and doesn't include any other states, for instance, I can give an example in Nebraska, when they put in a bill that was to teach about genocide, Holocaust and genocide, and listed the Armenian genocide. Eventually, the Turkish law came in. They had Armenian genocide removed, and we don't have a lot of supporters in Nebraska, and unfortunately, that's the way that got removed before the mandate passed. Now, does that mean Armenian genocide can't be taught in Nebraska? No, but we of course want it to be included. So what I would say is to find out, to find out if there's any, contact Armenian National Committee, Armenian Assembly. We're happy to help you in whatever state you might be in. We can tell you if there are efforts already underway. But second, to see, is there already an effort by non-Armenian groups to pass the same kind of law that you can piggyback on, and it's just necessary to make sure that Armenian genocide is part of what is going to be part of the bill.
Yeah, the Armenian genocide is recognized in, I believe, 49 of the 50 states now. So that should help as well. Sorry about Mississippi, right?
Yep.
Well, it's always one.
Mark, if I could just add to that, one of the biggest set of supporters that we encountered beyond communities that were themselves directly victimized by genocides were students, high school students and college students. And thank goodness there isn't a genocide happening in Armenia right now, but you know what? There are several going on in the world and more threatened as we talk about it here. And to the extent that students learn about that, it has a real impact on them, because in general, they're more idealistic than most of the people who are on this call. And they're looking for things that they can do. In Massachusetts, when that first bill was submitted in 2009, it was triggered by a high school student from the South Shore who was concerned about Darfur. But now students could be concerned about the Uyghurs, or concerned about what's happening in Tigray, or concerned about Burma, or so on. So you may be surprised at the kind of support there is from young people. Secondly, if you look around Massachusetts, what you discover is colleges and universities all over the place have departments in genocide studies now. That wasn't true when I was going to college, but it's true now. And some of them are state schools, like Salem State, for instance. So it could be that whatever state you're from, you already have state-paid resources who are in the business of teaching about genocide. And they are eager to help with their materials and their voices. They do it professionally. They want to help, and that was certainly the true as we discovered in enlisting their help in the campaign in Massachusetts.
Thank you. Another question says that Deborah Lipstadt, champion of Armenian genocide recognition, might be confirmed on Tuesday as the functional U.S. ambassador of anti-Semitism. How could her remarks about the continuum that includes the genocide, the Armenian genocide, and the Holocaust be useful to the Commonwealth and other states with teaching requirements?
Well, I mean, anytime you have someone speaking, like putting a focus on genocide, which obviously would be part of her purview as an ambassador on anti-Semitism issues, it raises the issue of human rights. It elevates the issue of human rights, because all too often, when there's always this counterbalancing in, say, I don't think it impacts as much on the education front, but when we talk about American government, the State Department is always, well, is it realpolitik? Is that a higher thing, protecting our allies no matter what they do, or is it human rights? So I think raising the profile of this will helps us in the country and internationally. It can also help because she has done serious work. Her most famous book is on the issue of genocide denial, Holocaust denial. But the fact that making that a part of it is something that a teacher could use, saying, well, that's Holocaust denial. Do you know that you actually have a state-funded genocide denial, and that's Armenian genocide denial? So the fact, any kind of profile that's given to the subject could be used by teachers when they want to talk about take a current events issue and make it part of what they might be teaching that particular day.
Thank you. This is a question for Lerna. Lerna, you in your comments, it says your goal is to show that any society is capable of genocide. But do you think that certain cultural ideas or religious ideas or others are more prone to push societies towards where genocide can occur?
Yes, I do. But these cultural ideas also come from history, right? Like they are the effects of history. They are not consequences of DNA. No one's biology, I don't think, is more violent than as groups, I mean. But for instance, in the Ottoman case that I know the most, obviously, since the Turkic group had historically been the dominant group, the state, the military, they will have certain kind of tools at their repertoire. Then the Christians and Jews who were, for instance, forbidden from serving in the military or rising to the top state power unless they converted to Islam, right? So if you only look at the moment of 1915, yes, Turks are way more likely to commit genocide than Armenians. But if Armenians had the this long durée of successful territorial sovereignty and monopoly of state violence, there is nothing that I can see that would prevent them from doing what the Turks did come 1918. This is a very, I mean, it's slippery ground, obviously. It needs to be argued very well, because it doesn't mean that, oh, it is what it is, everyone can do it, so what?
Saying everyone can do it
saying,
doesn't wash everyone's sins away, you know.
It doesn't, and it doesn't mean, it doesn't, it's not argued in order to ease the discomfort on anyone's part. Like if the Turk, actually they should be uncomfortable. This is what we keep talking about. For instance, at MIT, all these like this, a lot of American institutions of higher learning, for instance, they are doing this soul searching, right? Like how did we benefit from slave labor, or how did we, how are we based on native Indian land, right? Like the land grab, for instance. It is very uncomfortable to know this. But so what? I mean, it happened. It's like, it is what it is. So we live with it and we do whatever it takes to repair or restore some kind of justice, right? Like the same idea for the Turks. But this, I mean, I probably in middle school, high school, this cannot be discussed, but in response to Vazri's question, if genocide recognition, we use genocide recognition, not just Armenians, but the West. I mean, even before genocide was invented from Sevres on 1920, it was used to disqualify the Turks from the nation, from the family of nations, as they call it, right? Like from the civilized world. It was proof that Turks are savages because they did this to their own people who happen to be Armenian Christians, right? Which is to a certain extent correct. But also Americans also, we did it here. The white Americans also did it. We don't consider, like we talk about the Holocaust, right? We don't think of them, like Germans, do German students feel uncomfortable when Holocaust is discussed? Maybe they do, it's a healthy thing, but most likely they don't find it insulting because we talk about the Nazis, we talk about the righteous Germans, for instance. We need to have them, especially now that we passed this. Yes, America recognized it. I mean, even the last war or everything, we need to find a better and more historicized approach, less essentialist approach to talk about the Turkish responsibility here.
Thanks. It's a very good question here. Does the coalition that came together to get this legislation passed plan to form an independent committee to ensure the implementation? Or alternatively, does the legislation provide for the formation of a state commission to ensure implementation of the mandate? And who does that?
No, some states, yeah, it depends on what I mean. Some states, like for instance, Michigan, it actually created a commission under the governor to implement the mandate. That was not done in this case. The only thing it's created is the commissioner of primary and secondary education is supposed to manage the trust fund that will get in money from the hate crimes fines and then use that to assist, to give grants to assist communities in teaching about the genocide. So there is no, the law does not create a commission. And a commission is not necessary. The coalition that came together will certainly continue working, but it's largely going to be outreach to the Department of Education, and because they're the ones who are actually going to be writing it. So it's not, so any commission that we would create would not have any authority. So basically, we will just work. A number of altogether there was some 30 organizations that worked together as part of the coalition that came together. We will continue to keep in touch, but it's in order to make sure that share information. But the main thing is going to be to make sure that the input from the different communities that have experienced in their history genocide be included in the deliberations of whoever is revising the existing guidelines of the Department of Education.
And similarly, I don't know how many school districts there are in the Commonwealth, quite a few.
About 250.
About 250. So I gather then on Genocide Education Project, ANC, Armenian Assembly, other groups within this coalition to essentially go to 250 individual school districts and say, we would like you to include these resources, or here are these resources for you to make use of in implementing this new genocide mandate. Is that a fair statement?
Well, no, that's the resource piece is we want to make sure that the right resource, we work with the Department of Education, so they include the resources, that some of the resources we recommend in their in the guidelines they send out. So it would be, individuals going to their town saying, well, you should have already received, you've already got this mandate. You will be receiving, or you have received from the Department of Education, a list of resources that include books, include organizations you can contact, include organizations that can do teacher training, et cetera. So that kind of simplifies it. If they've gotten something officially from the Department of Education, says, here are the resources you can use, as long as those are the right resources, half our work is already done. And here, actually, I want to step back for a minute and just point out the difference as to what resources are available today, as opposed to 1999 when the original guidelines were written. In fact, I found an old copy. And yes, there's a handful of books here, and they're all fine. But compared to just what's happened the last 20 something years, there have been dozens of books written by all kinds of scholars about comparative genocide and specifically the Armenian genocide. These, back when 1997, most of the books were written by Armenians. Today, they're written by Armenians, they're written by non-Armenians, and especially they're written by Turkish scholars. Taner Akcam at Clark University, Müge Göçek at the University of Michigan. How better to say, when you're using, you've got resources to use, and it is not an IAN at the end of every name. That provides so much more for a teacher to say, oh, I've got all these impartial sources, and probably there's 20 more. So that is a big step forward. There, in fact, unlike 20 years ago, there are entire academic journals dedicated to the study of genocide and comparative genocide. The Journal of Genocide Research, Genocide Studies and Prevention, the publication of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. All these are available to the teachers. They are available to the DOE to include as possible resources. And so I think, we're in a much better place now than we were 25 years ago in trying to make sure this is done well.
No question.
Mark, I think I will just add, Mark, that I think it's a tall order to go to 250 districts and try to advocate this. But as Dikran said, it starts from the curriculum formation. So we want to make sure we advocate there for good material to be available. And then we will just start from, those areas where we are present, and then reach out from there to every district that we can. But I think that has to be sort of a step-by-step approach there.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. There are many, many interesting questions here. I'm trying, with apologies, to focus on those mainly that deal with the education component and not go too far astray into discussions of the history of the Armenian genocide or its denial or entities that may have participated in that. So I beg your indulgence. Teaching this question, teaching the Armenian genocide in middle and high schools in Massachusetts allows a more holistic historiography of American studies. The mandate allows a great opportunity to uncover an important chapter in American history, the rise of American internationalism, U.S. global voice, and emergence of modern humanitarianism. Works by Balakian and Wattenpaugh are important in this regard. To what extent, then, does this bill underscore this dimension of the teaching of the Armenian genocide, or does it not underscore it, but it certainly allows for it to develop? Yes? We've lost Lerna for the moment. Oh, she's back. Okay, but anyone can please jump in.
Well, I could speak to that. It underscores. There's nothing specifically in the bill for to cover how it affects American history, but it is something that's easily adapted or incorporated into it. I often point out when I'm explaining to teachers, I point out things like Jackie Coogan, the child actor who acted with Charlie Chaplin. We have a picture of him. He actually, as a movie star, sponsored his own relief boat of relief supplies going to Near East relief to help the survivors of the Armenian genocide. And that is what, yes, that is what Peter Balakian and Keith Wattenpaugh have written about. So that the issue of the Armenian genocide specifically is also a piece of our American history. Both the role of Henry Morgenthau, U.S. ambassador, all his consuls who gave him reports of what was going on, American missionaries, and of the relief efforts, which was the first time in American history that it was the first American relief to international relief. The start of all the humanitarian work that's been done by the United States, the relief to the survivors of the genocide was the very first. So in fact, there is a curriculum already written about this. One of Genocide Education Project's curricula is specifically about the American role in as witnesses to the Armenian genocide and in the relief afterwards. So if a teacher wants to teach about it, here's a ready curriculum. Here's a way to incorporate it, not into World War I history, not into world history, make it a part of American history. This was America, which would soon become isolationist after World War I, until World War II pulled it back in. Before they did that, they actually had become part of the world, initiated the League of Nations, and had done this huge international humanitarian effort. So it's American history.
I would say it's actually closer to home. It's a part of Massachusetts history, right? When you think about what happened in Massachusetts and all the relief efforts that started right from here, it's part of Massachusetts history.
The Congregationalist missionaries, yeah.
And unfortunately, on a less positive note, the legacy of until recently, U.S. resistance to recognition and participation in, let's say, Turkey's denial of the genocide is also part of the history. And I wanted to mention that actually in response to one question about how the question is, how does the typical high school student react to genocide teaching? And of course, I can't answer that, but I can speak to the few occasions when I've spoken at high schools about denial. And high school students get that really quickly, and they've been outraged when they've learned of the role that their own government may have played in it. That they get quickly, and it connects to them in a very direct way.
And Mark's being a little humble here. I mean, Mark has actually written a very good paper connecting Armenian genocide denial to denial by the tobacco lobby that smoking causes cancer. It's that kind of thing of connecting it to something that students can understand. You had those 7 heads of the tobacco companies saying no, testifying in Congress, no, tobacco does not cause cancer. That's kind of denial when you connect it, or today, say, climate change denial. You connect those types of denials to Armenian genocide denial, and you're absolutely right. My experience with students is they get it right away, probably sometimes even better than their seniors.
Question from Professor Whitehorn in Canada. Hello. And this is actually a profound question I'm not sure any of us can answer, but I want to ask the question anyway. How do you overcome the lack of the general public's and even teachers' knowledge about the long history, complex ethnic makeup, and changing geographic boundaries and place names in the region? And I think this is referring specifically to the Armenian genocide, but it can apply, in fact, to any of the cases that we're talking about here. General knowledge of these places in the world, including the increasingly distant past of World War II, is a real issue that anyone runs up against when you're talking to people about this history. How do you overcome that? How do you teach genocide when students may not even know where these places are or why anybody would have been fighting there? Please give me a good answer. I'm begging.
Well, one thought that I have, Mark, is that it isn't necessarily just a history lesson, but it's really a human rights lesson. It's a human rights interest, and in that context, perhaps it's less important where it is, what are the boundaries, what's the landscape, where are the borders, but really what happened to a certain group of people and why. So, perhaps in that context, it's different than really just a human rights context. Is really different than what happened in history context. I'm not sure if that would help, but perhaps, especially, younger generation perhaps can relate to that much better than as history.
I think that's a great point. And likewise, what Dikran was saying earlier, that yes, it doesn't have to be necessarily a part of the history lesson or memorizing, geographical locations, but the larger human rights and human issues can come through even if they may not remember exactly where to find on the map the location where this occurred. So
yeah, just to give an example, for instance, my 8th grader in Belmont Middle School, they have been reading in ELA, English, on the concept, they have been reading book after book on the concept of refugee. They read a book about the Holocaust refugee, and then they read, for instance, the last one they read was on a little boy, their age, more or less, who is a refugee of the Syrian war, which is very contemporary. I was really happily surprised that they would cover it. I don't think the students know or need to know much about the specific historical context, but thematically, it's great really that they connected Holocaust to the Syrian war in terms of how expelled kids long for home, try to adjust to new conditions. They even then covered the contemporary Afghan kids, not in literature, but they talked about how what's happening right now in Afghanistan, and some of them are coming now to our communities. How can we make sure that they don't go through the same kind of problem? So I think it depends on the district, the kind of teacher that you have, or the general, the political position leaning of the district maybe. But really, it doesn't matter if they know about the place or not. Even in history lessons, we don't ask them. It's the concepts that matter.
Well, yes.
If I could, yeah. Lerna is absolutely correct, but I think the place names issue is being raised is a little different. That was the fact that as part of cultural genocide, I think it was referring to changing names in order to erase history. And that I think is something that can be incorporated. And there's plenty of examples of that don't have to just be Armenian examples. You can say how it's been used in a number of countries, that if you want to erase your human rights violation or genocide from your past, well, try to erase the fact that those people even live there. Say their churches are not Armenian. Say it's something else. So I think that the cultural piece of it is something that can be incorporated. Again, and there it may not have to even be part of a history lesson. It can be part, it can be part of an art lesson, working the issue of architecture, the various architectures in what was Armenia, what was Western Armenia could be brought in by a teacher. So, and again, maybe that's an idea for a different curriculum altogether. Just talk about it, or the way that things are memorialized. I mean, one of the things that students, when I talk about denial, seem to connect with is the fact that you've got Talat Pasha Avenue in certain Turkish cities today. And I say, well, I've been to Germany 5 times. I've never seen Adolf Hitler Boulevard or Heinrich Himmlerstrasse. What is the difference between the two? Well, the German government forthrightly acknowledged what happened and has made amends afterwards. The Turkish government never has. So therefore, they are still changing place names and they're still honoring those who are perpetrators of genocide.
Do you folks who, let's call you the coalition here, is there a resource list that you have that can be shared, or is there a place that you would direct people who are watching to go to get resources, not only on the Armenian genocide, but of course on genocide education in general?
Well, there's I can think of 2 right out. The Armenian National Institute website has a good resource list. The Genocide Education Project website, genocideeducation.org, has many resources, and specifically for teachers, sample curricula, books, organizations, etc. So I would, and the Armenian National Committee, ANCA website also has a large list of resources. So I'd say any of those 3 are very good.
And lastly, Eric mentioned some names at the beginning, but if people want to contact legislators to thank them, I understand legislators like to be thanked when they do good things. Whom should they contact?
I think Eric mentioned Senator Rodriguez, if I'm not mistaken, but he was absolutely the co-sponsor and the force behind moving it through committee and making sure that went. So absolutely, he would be one. I mean, there were certainly others who moved things forward.
Representative Muradian, I believe.
I would absolutely say Representative Muradian. Dave Muradian was there along the way, and not only just now, but throughout the effort. So he was absolutely key, and reach out to Dave and certainly thank him for his efforts as well.
Good.
Yeah, and
with that,
and also,
then,
well,
yes.
Eric also mentioned Senate President Spilka, House Speaker Mariano also played key roles, and then your own, everyone's own state senator and state rep. Nobody was really opposed, but you could actually, most of them were actually co-sponsors. If you contact any of the organizations involved in the coalition, we're happy to tell you if your state rep and your state senator was a co-sponsor.
Right. And certainly, the representatives and senators that we have around Watertown area, so Senator Brownsberger was a big supporter as well as the representatives, which I know Dick and you were in touch with, Steve-O and Watertown.
Yeah, when there's a success, everyone wants to be the parent of the success, and as we know, failures are orphans. So at some level, any of your legislators, you could call and thank them. That would be a good message for them, even if they were one of the two representatives who voted against the bill in the end. Some people were very supportive, like Senator Brownsberger, but did not co-sponsor because as President Pro Tem of the Senate, that wasn't what he did. He had to take a step back from bills, but in the background, he was making calls for us.
Yep.
So it's there's a little bit of inside baseball here that's hard to know, but I wouldn't feel bad about you thanking people who were not instrumental, because they'll get a message, and that's what you want to accomplish. So, and the people you influence most are your own representatives. So if you're calling and they're for you, then they get a message.
Good
And
point.
just one other name I want to mention, Representative Lipper Garabedian, a new member of the House, an Armenian by choice. And if anybody is in her district, she was there also. She was co-sponsor. So do reach out to her and thank her as well.
Great. Well, then I want to say thank you myself to Lerna, Dikran, Eric, and Herman for your contributions tonight, for shedding light on this and insights. And, moving forward, let's see where we can go from here. There's a lot has been accomplished, and a lot needs to be done to really make it fully operational. So I look forward to what the next years have for education in Massachusetts. So thank you, and thank you to the audience, and thank you for all of your questions and comments, even if they were not fully addressed. Thank you, and good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.